It's what?
It's the yin-yang symbol. So it's a symbol that describes a couple things. Basically, it describes a balance, a perfect balance. However, it's not quite perfect, because if it was perfect, the line would go straight down the middle, like that. What's interesting about it is it can represent masculine and feminine energy, or it can represent chaos and order, night and day. And so we find this symbolic battle between chaos and order in all of these stories that we hear from ancient times, even Bible stories. Cain and Abel, Adam and Eve, we'll talk a little bit about that, in the chaos versus order. In the Adam and Eve, the order is the garden. It's the paradise that God made. But if any of you guys are familiar with that story, even though it was a paradise, there was still a snake in the garden. And that represents chaos. So what that's saying is that even God, there's an inherent chaos in order. They're connected. So even God could not create perfect order, because if you have order, a natural consequence of order and free will is going to be chaos. And they shift back and forth like night and day. So we'll talk a little bit about that more, but I'm going to start off by talking about the way we see things, perception. So we have to orient ourselves in a world where our knowledge, we don't know enough. We don't know everything. We can't know everything. And the way we see things might be different between each other. So is there one truth, or can both people be right? One way you can know if something's true or not is by finding out the story you told yourself about maybe your future, your plans, your goals. Well, you can look back and you can say, well, did it work out for me? Well, if it worked out for you, it's probably true. Your ideas about the situation were probably true. And just in the opposite, if it didn't work out, you can probably come to some conclusion that it wasn't true, or you tripped up somewhere. So one argument people are making now is that they're saying, say you're reading a book. Well, they would say there's many different ways to interpret that book. So all of them can be absolutely true. Well, life is way more complicated than a book, so how can you know which person is right and who's wrong? When two people disagree, they can't both be right. So it kind of confuses us. I see it as a decent argument that everybody's point of view is equal, but only one person can be right. So the way we see things has evolved over a tremendous period of time. And everything we see is actually based on our goals, what we want. And basically, from way back since the beginning, our goals were to survive and reproduce. And so that's kind of the lens that we see things through. Is this going to help me survive? Is this going to help me get to where I want to go? So in that way, there's not an infinite way to interpret things. It's actually limited, because it's in the scope of, is this going to help me or not? It's the way our brains are programmed. So for example, if I ran a business, I might have 20 employees. And in order for things to go smoothly, everyone has to agree on doing different jobs. If they all did the same job, it wouldn't work out. So it's a goal-directed thing, just like our brains. Otherwise, their jobs won't get done. So biologically, the reason that there's only one true, not everybody's right, there's limited perspective, it's because, like I said, we've evolved to see things for survival and reproduction being our goals. And that's going to narrow it down. It's not just going to let any viewpoint. We don't have enough brain space to hold all the potential viewpoints. So I shouldn't be talking about perception without talking about personality. And this is what I'm really here to talk about, and the most interesting part of the speech. In psychology, there are 5 personality traits that describe all of us. So some of us have some more than others, and that will describe your temperament, what you're more likely to do, how you'll react. So the 5 personality traits are openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And the personality is it's like a set of glasses you wear. It filters that helps you screen out what isn't relevant with what is important for your survival. So different people do see different things because they have different temperaments. And they want to fit into different places because, we all fit in the same place. We're all the same. It would get pretty crowded. So I'll start with the first one, extroversion. So extroversion, you may have heard of it before. It deals with variability of positive emotion. Some people are warm, social, bubbly when you interact with them. They're enthusiastic, smiley, they tell jokes, they thrive in social situations. They're assertive, they dominate the social space. So extroverted people feel most at home in the social world. They're not necessarily warm and compassionate and intimate. They're more entertaining and assertive and comical, excitable. They make, good salespeople. They like presenting in groups. They like to be the center of attention. That's extroversion. Okay, it's associated with a low threshold for experiencing positive emotion. So positive emotion is the force that drives you out into the world. Extroverts, they explore social environments and they're happy people. Introverts, the opposite, those are people who aren't necessarily always having social interactions. They tend to feel like they're recharging their batteries when they're alone. Their energy gets drained by social interactions, and introverts feel more at home in nature. They like it quiet. They're not unhappy, as in sad or anxious, but they're not overwhelmed with positive emotion like extroverts are. They tend to keep to themselves. So the second personality trait is known as neuroticism. Have you guys heard of that? Neuroticism. Well, a lot of people think it means crazy. It doesn't actually mean crazy. What it really is it means you are more likely to experience more negative emotion than somebody else if you're highly neurotic. So you're more likely to feel anxiety, emotional pain. What's interesting about this is that women are statistically much higher in neuroticism than men, about half a standard deviation more. What that means is if you took two people at random out of the general population, one man and one woman, and you assume that the woman was more sensitive to negative emotion, you'd be correct 60% of the time. Now, that's not a huge difference. It's almost 50-50. But what happens is, when you take the ends of it, you say, well, the most people that are going to feel the most negative emotion, it will almost always be a woman, and the person with the least negative emotion will almost always be a man. But men actually tend to be more disagreeable than women, so that's an interesting little twist. They're particularly resistant to negative emotion than men, but they have their own burdens too, men. They're more likely to have learning disorders and more likely to end up in prison because of the disagreeableness. Men are more likely to, yeah. So the negative emotions associated with neuroticism and sensitivity includes frustration, disappointment, grief. These are things you're going to feel if you're neurotic more than other people. Boys and girls didn't seem to have much different in negative emotions. The differences sort of kicked in at puberty. And this is also why women are more prone to depression and anxiety than men, while men are more prone to alcoholism and addiction than women, and antisocial personality disorder too. No one knows for sure why women are more prone to negative emotion than men, but psychologists have some theories that hold some decent weight. One of them is, by the time the woman hits puberty, her body's getting prepared to have an infant, and as a mother of an infant, the world's a very dangerous place. So being sensitive to negative emotions helps the woman be more attuned to the sorts of threats or challenges that might affect her baby. So women, they also tend to be smaller than men, so that puts them at a distinct disadvantage. It's perfectly reasonable for them to be more sensitive to negative emotion than men. They're also more sexually vulnerable because the negative consequences of having sex for a woman can be way more severe than for a man. A baby, lifetime responsibility. The third personality trait, that's agreeableness. So women are more agreeable than men in general, and that doesn't mean they're easier to get along with because they're higher in negative emotions still. Agreeable people are higher in compassion and politeness. The most agreeable people are almost all women, and the least agreeable people are almost all men. So if you looked at the least agreeable person out of 100, he would almost always be a man and would massively be likely to be in prison. Agreeable people are compliant. They want to please. If they negotiate, they're more likely to negotiate on behalf of other people. They have a hard time drawing a firm line for themselves. They get paid less because, part of the reason women get paid less is because women are more agreeable. And so more agreeable people have a harder time, like I said, negotiating for themselves. they'll take the burden for other people so things go smoothly. Disagreeable people are blunt, they're harsh, they're brisk. They'll tell you exactly what they think. And they don't try to avoid conflict that would hurt other people's feelings. And agreeable people do not like conflict. They'll do almost anything to avoid it. And agreeable is also a predictor of politically correct attitudes. So they preach the virtues of empathy and compassion above all else. There are downsides to agreeableness too. One downside is that agreeable people get taken advantage of. They struggle to be in positions where they're disliked. And this makes agreeable people have a difficult time holding jobs in management positions because you have to tolerate being the bad guy if you have a management type of job or a supervisory position. The biggest difference there is between men and women is an interest in people versus an interest in things. So if you give chimpanzee infants a choice between two toys, and one of the toys is a thing, like a car or a truck or a gadget, and one of the choices is a people-like thing, like a doll or an action figure. Well, what's interesting is the female chimps will always choose the people-like things, the dolls, and the males will always choose the things, and that goes the same way for men versus women. That's why we see more men engineers, more women in positions that work with people like nurses. The fourth personality trait is conscientiousness, and this is an interesting one. So conscientious people, they're orderly and they're industrious. So orderly people like to keep things in the boxes they belong in. And it's an important personality trait for political belief too. They like to keep things in those boxes. They want them to stay in the damn box where they belong. Orderly people are more likely to be conservative politically. That's why they're concerned with borders. And orderly people like the borders between things to stay intact. They like the gender roles to remain stable. They don't like different foods on their plate touching. They don't like abstract art, and they want things in those boxes where they were put. And industrious people can't stand to sit around and do nothing. They're motivated by duty and also possibly by shame and guilt. They're people that are always working. And conscientiousness is the best long-term indicator of success besides IQ in psychology. So at one point, although conscientiousness is not linked with IQ at all. So just because you're more orderly doesn't mean you're more intelligent, which is interesting. It's actually the opposite. It's the more creative people tend to have higher IQs. You'd be surprised. They just have a harder time making money because it's really tough to have creative pursuits. You're either going to be highly successful with it like a musician, you're either going to sell millions of records or barely any. And that's just the distribution. It's like Monopoly. One person's always going to end up with all the money. It's the same way in creative pursuits. So at one point, I had to prepare the speech. And this is an example of conscientiousness. So even though I find this stuff really interesting, in the moment, there's other things I would have enjoyed doing more. But the idea of conscientious people is that they sacrifice the present moment for a better future. And so they're making a sacrifice, investing in the future. They are putting off the pursuits of just instantly in the moment feeling good for something in the future. Conscientious people have an easier time doing that, while open, creative people are more prone to seeking impulsive pleasures, to just concerning themselves with what feels good now in the moment, which can lead to a pretty chaotic lifestyle. And conscientious people make plans and they like to stick with them. They save for their future. They're always doing what they should do instead of what they want to do. What seems to drive orderliness in the brain is a sensitivity to disgust. Actually, Hitler was extremely high in orderliness by all appearances. He was very sensitive to disgust. And this is where it gets interesting, because you think it would be a good thing to be highly conscientious, but here's an example of how it can be bad. Disgust is an emotion that protects you from contamination. Hitler's fundamental metaphor for his Aryan race was a body. And from his point of view, he was attempting to protect that pure body from infiltration by what he thought are contaminating agents. For him, those were anything foreign, particularly Judaism. Hitler started his purification processes with public health endeavors. He took 4 showers a day. Also, with attempts to beautify Germany. One of his orders, for example, was that the factories needed to be cleaned by the factory owners, and they also fumigated them with the same to kill the bugs and the rats. He used the same gas to kill the bugs and the rats that he later used in the chambers. He wanted to get rid of the insects first, but then he moved to the mental hospitals and he started euthanizing people. And then he expanded that to include the Jews and the gypsies and everyone he regarded as contamination. It was the disgust system in our brains gone overload. He, like I said, he bathed 4 times a day. He was a worshiper of willpower, and conscientious people are advocates of willpower. Obviously, there's some use in that, but you can see how being over-orderly can lead to a really dark place. So now we'll go to the other side, people who are liberal. They're usually low in orderliness, the opposite, and they're high in openness. So they're creative. They want borders to be open. They don't want there to be strict structure and rules and regulations. And they don't want there to be defined genders or countries. And this is because they see great advantage in the trading of information between group A and B. And they're right. They're right to think that. But there's also historical danger in this. For example, the Europeans came to the Americas and Mexico, and the natives, their immune systems weren't prepared to handle the germs that the Europeans brought. So Europeans coming over, foreigners, wiped out 95% of the Native Americans just from disease. And so there is sort of a historical reason to be concerned about borders, but also there's benefits to having open borders too. And this is why the liberals and conservatives will always argue about how open our borders should be. The conservatives say, oh, it's too dangerous. Liberals say you're missing tremendous potential advantages from the exchange of information. So are we born with personality traits that we currently have? Studies show that we most likely are. A Harvard professor was doing a study on children who were high in neuroticism and introversion. So they were really exposed to negative emotion more often, and they liked to keep to themselves. They didn't like new things. He found that children as young as 6 months were way more reactive to threatening and unexpected stimuli. Their startle reflexes were higher than other children. They were more likely to cry or to become irritable and to shy away from strangers. He also found that if you had a child who was timid, irritable, and shy, you could make it even more so by overprotecting them. You could also lower their inhibition by encouraging them to explore and to go out into the unknown. But it has to be their decision. If they feel like they're being forced, they'll release different chemicals than if they decide to do it. So part of the reason we have to interact with each other is so that we can meet other people with different personality traits and measure that against our own and figure out a way we can get along. You're born with your temperament sort of like a natural ability or a skill, and they're yours to go out and develop. It takes effort to develop them and balance them to a point where you can be a reasonably balanced person. For example, a kid high in extroversion, they're more likely to be impulsive, to go out and stir up trouble. So if you're an extrovert, you might want to put some effort into building your restraint, thinking more before you act. Whereas if you're introverted or you're high in neuroticism, you'll want to make the effort to put yourself in social situations where you'll feel uncomfortable, but you'll develop social skills and you'll avoid developing things like anxiety and agoraphobia, which is like a fear to leave the house or to go out new places. A disagreeable person, they have to learn how to be compassionate. Compassionate person has to learn how to be tough, to stand up for yourself. It's hard, but it can be done. Agreeable people avoid conflict. One of the issues with that is by avoiding conflict, you're avoiding short-term solutions, or you're getting a short-term solution, but you're not getting a medium to long-term. You're putting it off, right? And so it never really solves what the issue is if you're over-agreeable, and you're just going to end up frustrated and resentful. So they'll often sacrifice their own wants and needs to keep everyone else in the group happy. But being nice isn't enough to get you through life. You can potentially be trampled over if you can't stick to your boundaries. So now I'll switch it up a little bit and talk about Adam and Eve. So that story is really, I know we've probably all heard it before, but I think I can put some symbolism into it and tell you guys some new things about it. So, like I said, most of us are familiar with it, but hopefully I'll shed some new light. And so basically I'll paraphrase. In the beginning, God creates a paradise, which I alluded to earlier. And he creates Adam and the animals, and he lets Adam name the animals, which is interesting because that alone is, he said he created Adam in his own likeness, which is like he's like a God in himself, so he's letting him name something, which is something like what a God would do. However, obviously it's not challenging the status of God, but he built him in his likeness. So he created the woman from the man using his rib, and their paradise was like a beautiful garden, which provided all of their needs. So they weren't yet self-conscious here. So in a sense, they were still like animals. They were unaware or unashamed of their nakedness. They didn't know. And God tells them that they can eat from everything in the garden besides one thing, and that's the fruit of knowledge between good and evil. And God tells them if they eat from it, then they'll surely die. Now I'm going to tell you something about vision. Humans have excellent vision. First of all, we see color. Hardly any other creatures see color at all. Plus, our vision is extremely acute. So the only other animals that can see as well as us are birds of prey. We can see much better than mammals or primates. Why? Well, that's a bit of a mystery, but it seems that a woman in California might have recently discovered it. She studies predator versus prey relationships in the ecosystem. She knew that millions of years ago, our tree-dwelling ancestors were frequently preyed on by snakes. And there's some evidence that our tree-dwelling ancestors and snakes actually co-evolved together. So our visual systems are particularly good at picking up the patterns of the camouflage that snakes use to hide in the trees or the undergrowth. And this scientist found if you looked at primate population around the world, where there were more predatory snakes, the primates could see better. And it's a really high correlation. So she concluded that the reason human beings can see so well is partly because of snakes. And we don't know where the Adam and Eve story came from, but it's ancient, and it's stuck and survived Father Time because it's extremely accurate summary. Snakes gave us vision, basically. So if you haven't heard the full story, I'll conclude it for you. One day the snake approaches Eve while she's eating in the garden. And the fact that there's a snake to begin with in paradise created by God is important. I talked about this before, but the garden represented perfect order. And even God couldn't create perfect order without also creating chaos. Chaos and order are connected, like that symbol. They're intricately linked together. So anytime you have free will or consciousness, you're going to have chaos. So the snake approaches Eve and asks her, "Are you allowed to eat from any tree of the garden?" And she replies, "Yes, I'm allowed to eat from any tree of the garden besides this one." And he says, God says, if we eat from it, we'll die. And so the snake kind of scoffs at this and tells Eve, this is the tree of knowledge between good and evil, and if you eat from it, surely you won't die, and you'll be like us, like gods. And Eve is convinced. She eats from the tree. The first thing they do after they eat, she gets Adam to eat it as well. First thing they do is they create clothes out of leaves. And this is because instantly they say there's flakes fall from their eyes and they can see. Snake gave us vision. And they realize they're naked. But what that is they're self-conscious. A lot of people have dreams of being naked in front of a crowd. What that really represents is your vulnerabilities. Okay, so they realize they're vulnerable now. They're not in paradise anymore. So when God finds out what happens, he punishes everybody involved. He says, for the snake, he says, "I'll curse you to crawl on your belly the rest of your days and eat dust, and you'll bite the heel of man, while man's heel will crush your head." What's interesting is we found out, snakes actually used to have legs. So that part of the story is oddly enough true. Weird to think of snakes with legs. But so for Adam, his punishment is basically that he will have to work now. He's not going to just be able to prance around the garden collecting food and have a long, easy life. It's the beginning of culture by the clothing, but also suffering for mankind. For woman, God says she'll have to have that painful childbirth and basically to be under man's judgment or to be with man And what about the fruit, though? Why fruit? Well, the reason our visual system evolved to see color is to detect ripe fruit. So an interesting fact is that snakes did have the legs, and there's a weird interconnection in Genesis between women, fruit, and snakes. The idea is that women were gatherers, so they also shared food with men, and humans are one of the only animals that share food like this. And women did tempt men with fruit historically, in this sense, and they did make themselves conscious along with the snake that helped them, our visual system, and fruit helped us become more aware, helped us to see better. And that was a catastrophe for us, though. And what happens in the story when they eat the fruit is their vision improves, the scales fall from their eyes, and all of a sudden they can see in a way that no other animal had seen. And they could see they're naked, and that's a big problem. And you might ask, well, what does that being naked mean? Again, it's the being vulnerable. To become highly self-aware is to wake up into a nightmare, to be self-conscious, hyper-self-conscious. You can't think, you're nervous, you're so worried about yourself, you blind your vision of what's actually happening. So everyone, strangely enough, has this basically, a consequence from when they were banished was we had a need for redemption now, and that we have to work. And everyone, strangely enough, has this intuition that we're in a fallen state, that something in the world needs to be fixed. And, that we have a role to play in that. That's something that is beneath in our being that we can feel. And the solution to being's inherent suffering is like within us. It's a mystery, but it's a calling to us. And the next thing that happens in Genesis is that Cain and Abel are born. You guys know the story of Cain and Abel? They were the first actual two human beings because Adam and Eve were created by God, so they weren't actually born. But Cain and Abel were born by humans. What happens between Cain and Abel is basically they both make a sacrifice to God. Cain was a farm worker, basically agriculturalist, and Abel was a shepherd. By the way, shepherd, we think of shepherd as just prancing along with sheep, but back then they had big animals, big tigers, lions coming after them. It was a tough job. And, both jobs they had were tough. So basically, Abel just sort of had better luck than Cain. All throughout life, people liked him better, things were just easier for him. Cain was the firstborn, and he was supposed to get an inheritance and all that sort of thing, and it just didn't work out his way. So they make a sacrifice one day to God, and, the reason they burn their sacrifice is because they thought God's up there, so how do we get our thing up there? We don't just throw the lamb up in the air, we gotta burn it so that the smoke will go up to God. And the bottom line was that God didn't like Cain's sacrifice as much as Abel. And it doesn't say in the Bible if Cain's sacrifice wasn't as good, if he was cutting corners, or if God just didn't like it. And that's kind of cool because in life, we don't always know necessarily, is there always a reason for something to go wrong? Sometimes things just go wrong. And so what happens is Cain becomes resentful and he questions God. And he says, this universe you made, it isn't fair. You got to do something about it. Make it even. And basically God says, well, you're not sacrificing the right things, so don't come to me and tell me how to run the universe. And Cain didn't like that. And so he got in this state of resentful, murderous resentment. And, it's the first pattern of behavior that humans take up once they became self-conscious after the garden. And what it says is there are like two responses to realizing that you are a participant in an unfair world. And one is associated with the murderous state of resentment, Cain, towards life. It's the same kind of resentment that drove all the school shootings that we've been seeing. It's just a resentment towards life. And if life is unfair and it only causes suffering, then psychologically it makes sense to just relieve everybody from that suffering by killing them, which is terrible and psychopathic. But you can see how the line of thinking works. The other way to view it, being in an unfair world, is Abel's attitude. It's an attitude of making the proper sacrifices in the present to make a better future. And these two attitudes can respectively lead you to an experience of a sort of heaven on earth versus a hell on earth. and you can see the difference when two people have these differences of attitudes. So after everything there with Cain and Abel, it dissolved into the flood. That's chaos again, coming through nature. Chaos, water is associated with chaos. The god of chaos was Tiamat, like a dragon in the water, and is wiping out mankind's crooked ways. But it's still a cycle, because out of that chaos comes order again, never ending. So neither order nor chaos can hold reign for long before the other takes a turn. And after the flood, the Tower of Babel was erected, a symbol of pride. And it's like the Twin Towers, same thing. It's man trying to reach up to heaven to be close to God. And one of the consistent warnings in the Bible is warnings against the sin of pride. It's an intellectual sin. Basically, it's saying, I know enough to do without the transcendent, or nothing knows more than me. And the biblical stories made it very clear that sort of thinking is very dangerous, that you always have to be aware that there's some sort of transcendence above your level of knowledge and understanding. And people who don't believe this tend to be tyrants and totalitarians, like Hitler I mentioned earlier, or any of them, Stalin, because they believe that their belief is total and it can't be challenged. And what happens when people become totalitarians is you get a creation of something that closely resembles hell, like Nazi Germany or communist Russia. So keep in mind that your natural personality traits, well, the communist Russia thing is really interesting. I'm going to touch on it for a second, because we all hear the story about the Nazis and how terrible that was, when there were 6 million Jews and people killed in that. But shortly around that same period of time, what was going on in Russia was a movement that is actually coming back now politically, which is really scary. And that's because we're not being educated about it. And there's a reason for that, and that's because there's a lot of communist sympathizers in the intellectual realm, so they don't want to get this side of the story out, because they support the idealism. But what happened was, they had an ideal in Russia to try to even things out between the rich and the poor. So in general, it's a good idea, but what they found out is it has terrible consequences. One of the things they did was they had these farmers who were just barely above peasant level. They had been serfs, which was basically slaves, and then a couple generations later they worked hard enough to get a little bit of wealth, maybe a few cows and a couple servants. And when this new ideals came into Russia, they said, okay, so all of your grain that you're producing, we're going to take it, it's going to go to the city, to the poor people that need it. They took every single grain from the farmers. They made it illegal for even a mother, after all the grain was taken through, she would go crawl on her hands and knees and look for single grains to feed her kid. Punishment was death for that. And it was so bad, well, they didn't realize the consequences, was they kicked out all the farmers after they stole all their stuff, sent them to Syria where they froze to death, and then after that, 60 million people starved to death because there were no more farmers to produce their food. And it was so bad they had to make signs saying, remember it's wrong to eat your baby. And they had a similar sort of thing. Yeah, question?
I'm sorry, but I had to leave, so don't think I'm just
of course.
walking out on you.
No worries. Have a good one. So they had a similar thing to the Nazis as the concentration camps, these Russians. But the difference was they had political prisoners. So anybody who disagreed with this philosophy of taking from the people who have more to give to the people who have less, taking everything, demanding it, they were sent to these concentration camps. They were called gulags, and they were just as bad. And what they did is they also had the general prisoners, like murderers, rapists, lifetime thieves. And what they did is they put the rapist murderers in charge of the political prisoners, because they said, you were only criminals because of our system was crooked, and that's why. And you wouldn't have been criminals otherwise. It's terrible, we know that's not true now. So oftentimes we had the criminals abusing the political prisoners. And basically, result of this catastrophe, 60 million dead, 30 to 60 million, completely way more than Nazi Germany, but we hardly hear about it in schools. It's not taught in American high schools. It's taught in Russian high schools, but not American. And that's because we have a lot of intellectuals that want to bring back this ideals of trying to take from people who have more and giving to people who have less. So it's an idealism based on like compassion, but it leads to destruction because we haven't found a way to even things out without causing catastrophe. So keep in mind what your natural personality traits are, if you're more orderly or if you're more creative, and what the downsides are. Remember, if you're more orderly, the downsides are that you're not very open to new things and that you have to have things your way, and you can be controlling and a tyrant about it. And if you're very open, then the downside can be you don't have enough structure, maybe you're late all the time, or you have a hard time following through with projects. And even if you don't believe in the Bible literally, the message here was always remember that there's something transcendent and above your own understanding. And to understand that is vital to having like the best life experience that you can. And we'll definitely have time for some questions if you guys want. Thank you. I know there's a lot.
It was very nice.
There's a
Thank
lot
you.
of
It's
stuff.
very interesting.
Yes.
But you know what? As you're describing these different personalities, I find that you
Yeah.
have a little bit of this one, a little bit of this one,
Uh-huh.
a little bit of this one. Is that possible?
Yeah, so
Not totally one or the other.
that's right. And what happens is like there's tests you can actually take, which I've taken myself, but we all have a little, it's just at varying degrees. So some you're gonna have more of it, and others you're gonna have low of it, but you're still gonna have some of all of them.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
and basically babies are born with all of them, and their environment kind of changes and tilts things a certain way. Also, babies are born speaking the syllables of all potential languages, and then when they hear the language that's around them, they start to lose those extra ones that they don't need. So basically, we're born with all this potential, and it's just kind of narrowed in by our lifestyle.
I see.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's really cool.
I got